The Fifth Surprise of the Surprising Adventures of the Magical Monarch of Mo and His People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Diana Meilinger. The Surprising Adventures of the Magical Monarch of Mo and His People by L. Frank Baum. The Fifth Surprise. The monarch celebrates his birthday. There were great festivities in the valley of Mo when the king had a birthday. The jolly monarch was born so many years ago that so everyone had forgotten the date. One of the wise men said the king was born in February, another declared it was in May, and the third figured a great event happened in October. So the king issued a royal decree that he should have 3 birthdays every year in order to be on the safe side, and whenever he happened to think of it, he put in an odd birthday or two for luck. The king's birthdays came to be regarded as very joyful events, for on these occasions festivities of unusual magnificence were held, and everybody in the kingdom was invited to participate. On one occasion the king, suddenly recollecting he had not celebrated his birthday for several weeks, announced a royal festival on the most elaborate scale. The cream puff crop was an unusually large one, and the bushes were hanging full of the delicious ripe puffs, which were highly prized by the people of Mo. So all the maidens got out their best dresses and brightest ribbons, and the young men carefully brushed their hair and polished their boots, and soon the streets leading to the palace were thronged with gay merrymakers. When the guests were all assembled, a great feast was served, in which the newly picked cream puffs were an important item. Then the king stood up at the head of the table and ordered his ruby casket to be brought him, and when the people heard this, they at once became quiet and attentive, for the ruby casket was one of the most curious things in the valley. It was given the king many years before by the sorceress Maeda, and whenever it was opened, something was found in it that no living person had seen before. So the people, and even the king himself, always watched the opening of the ruby casket with much curiosity, for they never knew what would be disclosed. The king placed the casket on a small table before him, and then, after a solemn look at the expectant faces, he said slowly, "Giggle, gaggle, goo," which was the magic word that opened the box. At once the lid flew back, and the king peered within and exclaimed, "Ha!" This made the guests more excited than before, for they did not know what he was saying "ha" about, and they held their breath when the king put his thumb and his finger into the box and drew out a little wooden man about as big as my finger. He wore a blue jacket and a red cap, and had a little brass horn in his hand. The king stood the wooden man upon the table, and then reached within the box and brought out another wooden man, dressed just the same as the other, and also holding a horn in his hand. This the king stood beside the first wooden man, and then took out another, and another, until 10 little wooden men were standing in a row on the table, holding drums and cymbals and horns in their small, stiff hands. "I declare," said the king when he had stood them all up, "it's a little German band. But what a shame it is they cannot play." No sooner had the king uttered the word "play" than every little wooden man put his horn to his mouth, or beat his drum, or clashed his cymbal, and immediately they began to play such delicious music that all the people were delighted, and even the king clapped his hands in applause. Just then, from out of the casket leaped a tiny baby elephant, about as large as a mouse, and began capering about on its toes. It was dressed in short, fluffy skirts, like those worn by a ballet dancer, and it danced so funnily that all who saw it roared with laughter. When the elephant stopped to rest, 2 pretty green frogs sprang from the casket and began to play leapfrog before the astonished guests, who had never before seen such a thing as a frog. The little green strangers jumped over each other quick as a flash, and finally one of them jumped down the other's throat. Then, as the baby elephant opened his mouth to yawn, the remaining frog jumped down the elephant's throat. The audience was so much amused at this feat that the baby elephant thought he would see what he could do to please them. So he stood on his head and gave a great jump and disappeared down his own throat, leaving the musicians to play by themselves. Then all the young men caught the girls about their waists and began spinning around in a pretty dance of their own, and the fun continued until they were tired out. The King thanked the tiny wooden musicians and put them back in the ruby casket. He did not offer to take up a collection for them, there being no money of any kind in the Valley of Mo. The casket was then carried back to the royal treasury, where it was guarded with much care when not in use. Just then a young man approached the King, asking permission for the people to skate on the Crystal Lake, and His Majesty graciously consented. As it was never cold in the kingdom of Mo, there was, of course, no ice for skating. But the Crystal Lake was composed of sugar syrup, and the sun had candied the surface of the lake, so it had become solid enough to skate on, and was, moreover, as smooth as glass. It was not often the King allowed skating there, for he feared someone might break through the crust, but as it was his birthday, he could refuse the people nothing. So presently hundreds of boys and girls were skating swiftly on the Crystal Lake, and having rare sport, for it was just as good as ice, without being cold or damp. In the center there was one place where the crust was quite thin, and just as the merriment was at its height, crack went the ice, or candy rather, and down into the sugar syrup sank the Princess Truella, and the Prince Jollikin, and the King's royal chamberlain, Nuphsed. Down and down they went until they reached the bottom of the lake, and there they stood, stuck fast in the syrup and unable to move a bit, while all the people gathered on the shore to look at them, the lake being as clear as the clearest water. Of course this calamity put an end to further skating, and the King rushed around asking everyone how he could get his daughter and his son and his royal chamberlain out of the mess. But no one could tell him. Finally the King consulted the wise donkey, and after he had thought the matter over, and consulted his learning, the donkey advised His Majesty to fish for them. "Fish!" exclaimed the King. "How can we do that?" "Take a fish line and put a sinker on it, to make it sink through the syrup. Then bait the end of the line with the thing that each one of them likes best. In that way you can catch hold of them and draw them out of the lake." "Well," said the King, "I'll try it, for of course you know what you are talking about." "Have you ever eaten a geography?" demanded the wise donkey. "No," said the King. "Well, I have," declared the donkey, haughtily, "and what I don't know about lakes and such things isn't in the geography." So the King went back to the Crystal Lake and got a strong fish line, which he tied to the end of a long pole. Then he put a sinker on the end of the line, and was ready for the bait. "What does the Princess Truella like best?" he asked the Queen. "I'm sure I do not know," replied the royal lady, "but you might try her with a kiss." So one of the nicest young men sent a kiss to the Princess, and the King tied it to the end of the line and put it in the lake. The sinker carried it down through the sugar syrup until the kiss was just before the sweet red lips of the pretty Princess. She took the kiss at once, as the Queen had guessed, and the King pulled up the line, with the Princess at the end of it, until he finally landed her on the shore. Then all the people shouted for joy, and the Queen took the Princess Truella home to change her clothes, for they were very sticky. "What does the Prince Jollikin like best?" asked the King. "A laugh," replied a dozen at once, for everyone knew the Prince's failing. Then one of the girls laughed quite hard, and the King tied it to the end of the line, and dropped it into the lake. The Prince caught the laugh at once, and was quickly drawn from the syrup and likewise sent home to change his clothes. Then the King looked around at the people and asked, "What does the chamberlain Nuphsed like best?" But they were all silent, for Nuphsed liked so many things it was difficult to say which he liked best. So again the King was obliged to go to the wise donkey, in order to find out how he should bait the line to catch the royal chamberlain. The wise donkey happened to be busy that day over his own affairs, and was annoyed at being consulted so frequently without receiving anything in return for his wisdom. But he pretended to consider the matter, as was his wont, and said, "I believe the royal chamberlain is fond of apples. Try to catch him with a red apple." At this the King and his people hunted all over the kingdom, and at last found a tree with one solitary red apple growing on a little branch nearly at the top. But unfortunately someone had sawed off the trunk of the tree, close up to the branches, and had carried it away and chopped it up for kindling wood. For this reason there was no way to climb the tree to secure the apple. While the King and the people were considering how they might get into the tree, Prince Thinkabit came up to them and asked what they wanted. "We want the apple," replied the King, "but someone has cut away the tree trunk, so that we cannot climb up." Prince Thinkabit rubbed the top of his head a minute, to get his brain into good working order. It was a habit he had acquired. Then he walked to the bank of the river, which was near, and whistled 3 times. Immediately a school of fishes swam up to him, and one of the biggest cried out, "Good afternoon, Prince Thinkabit. What can we do for you?" "I wish to borrow a flying fish for a few minutes," replied the Prince. Scarcely had he spoken when a fish flew out of the river and perched upon his shoulder. Then he walked up to the tree and said to the fish, "Get me the apple." The flying fish at once flew into the tree and bit off the stem of the apple, which fell down and hit the King on the nose, for, unfortunately, he was standing exactly under it. Then the Prince thanked the flying fish and sent it back to the river, and the King, having first put a plaster over his nose, took the apple and started for the Crystal Lake, followed by all his people. But when the apple was fastened to the fish line and let down through the syrup to the royal chamberlain, Nuphsed refused to touch it. "He doesn't like it," said the King with a sigh, and he went again to the wise donkey. "Didn't he want the apple?" asked the donkey, as if surprised. But you must know he was not surprised at all, as he had planned to get the apple for himself. "No, indeed," replied the King. "We had an awful job to find the apple, too." "Where is it?" inquired the donkey. "Here," said the King, taking it out of his pocket. The donkey took the apple, looked at it thoughtfully for a moment, and then ate it up and smacked his lips, for he was especially fond of red apples. "What shall we do now?" asked the King. "I believe the thing Nuphsed likes best is a kind word. Bait the line with that, and you may catch him." So the King went again to the lake, and having put a kind word on the fish line, quickly succeeded in bringing the royal chamberlain to the shore in safety. You can well imagine poor Nuphsed was glad enough to be on dry land after his long immersion in the sugar syrup. And now that all had been rescued from the Crystal Lake, the King put a rope around the broken crust, and struck up a sign that said "Danger," so that no one else would fall in. After that the festivities began again, and as there were no further accidents, the King's birthday ended very happily. End of the 5th surprise.
Of the surprising adventures of the Magical Monarch of Mo and his people. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Miriam Esther Goldman. The Surprising Adventures of the Magical Monarch of Mo and His People by L. Frank Baum. The 6th Surprise. King Scowlyow and his Cast-Iron Man. Across the mountains at the north of the Valley of Mo, there reigned a wicked king named Scowlyow, whose people lived in caves and mines and dug iron and tin out of the rocks and melted them into bars. These bars they then carried away and sold for money. King Scowlyow hated the monarch of Mo and all his people because they lived so happily and cared nothing for money, and he would have sent his army into the valley to destroy the merry people who dwelt there had he not been afraid of the sharp swords that grew on their trees, which they knew so well how to use against their foes. So King Scowlyow pondered for a long time how to destroy the Valley of Mo without getting hurt himself, and at last he hit on a plan he believed would succeed. He put all his mechanics to work and built a great man out of cast iron, with machinery inside of him. When he was wound up, the cast-iron man could roar and roll his eyes and gnash his teeth and march across the valley, crushing trees and houses to the earth as he went. For the cast-iron man was as tall as a church and as heavy as iron could make him, and each of his feet was as big as a barn. It took a long time to build this man, as you may suppose, but King Scowlyow was so determined to ruin the pretty Valley of Mo that he made his men work night and day, and at last the cast-iron man was ready to be wound up and sent on his journey of destruction. They stood him on top of the mountain, with his face toward the beautiful valley, and began to wind him up. It took 100 men a whole week to do this, but at last he was tightly wound, and the wicked King Scowleyow stood ready to touch the spring that made him go. "1, 2, 3!" said the king, and touched the spring with his ringer. The cast-iron man gave so terrible a roar that he even frightened the men who had made him, and then he rolled his eyes till they flashed fire, and gnashed his teeth till the noise sounded like thunder. The next minute he raised one great foot and stepped forward, crushing 50 trees that stood in his path, and then away he went, striding down the mountain, destroying everything that stood in his way, and nearing with every step the beautiful Valley of Mo. The king and his people were having a game of ball that day, and the dog was acting as umpire. Suddenly, just as Prince Jollikin had made a home run and everybody was applauding him, a terrible roaring noise sounded in their ears, and they heard a great crashing of trees on the mountainside, and saw a monstrous man approaching the valley. The people were so frightened they stood perfectly still, being unable to move through surprise and terror, but the dog ran with all his might toward the mountain to see what was the matter. Just as the dog reached the foot of the mountain, the cast-iron man came tramping along and stepped into the valley, where he ruined in one instant a large bed of ladyfingers and a whole patch of ripe pumpkin pies. Indeed, the entire valley would soon have been destroyed had not the cast-iron man stubbed his toe against the dog and fallen flat on his face, where he lay roaring and gnashing his teeth, but unable to do any further harm. Presently the king and his people recovered from their fright and gathered around their prostrate foe, marveling at his great size and strength. "Had you not tripped him up," said the king to the dog, "this giant would certainly have destroyed my kingdom. Who do you suppose was so wicked as to send this monster to crush us?" "It must have been King Scowleyow," declared the dog, "for no one else would care to harm you, and the giant came from the direction of the wicked king's country." "Yes," replied the monarch thoughtfully, "it must indeed have been Scowleyow, and it was a very unkind act, for we never harmed him in any way. But what shall we do with this great man? If he is left here he will scare all the children with his roarings, and none of the ladies will care to walk near this end of the valley. He is so heavy that not all of us together could lift him, and even if we succeeded, we have no place to put him where he would be out of the way." This was indeed true, so all the people sat down in a circle around the cast-iron man, and thought upon the matter intently for the space of an hour. Then the monarch asked solemnly, as became the importance of the occasion, "Has anyone thought of a way to get rid of him?" The people shook their heads gravely, and thought deeply for another hour. At the end of that time the dog suddenly laughed, and called out in a voice so loud that it startled them, "I have thought of a way!" "Good!" exclaimed the king. "Let us hear your plan." "You see," explained the dog, "the cast-iron man is now lying on his face. If we could only roll him over onto his back, and then raise him to his feet again, he would be turned around, and would march straight back to where he came from, and do us no further harm." "That is a capital idea," replied the king. "But how can we roll him over, or make him stand up?" That puzzled them all for a while, but by and by Prince Thinkabit, who was a very clever young man, announced his readiness to undertake the job. "First, bring me a feather," commanded the prince. The royal chamberlain hunted around and soon found for him a long, fluffy feather. Taking this in his hand, the prince approached the cast-iron man and tickled him under the left arm with the end of the feather. "Ouch!" said the cast-iron man, giving a jump and rolling completely over so that he lay on his back. "Hurrah!" cried the people, clapping their hands with joy at this successful stratagem. "The prince is a very wise prince indeed." Prince Thinkabit took off his hat and bowed politely to them in return for the compliment. Then he said, "Bring me a pin." So Nuphsed brought him a pin with a very sharp point, and the prince took it and walked up to the cast-iron man and gave him a sharp prod in the back with the point of the pin. "Ouch!" again yelled the cast-iron man, giving at the same time such a great jump that he leaped square on his feet. But now, to their joy, they saw he was facing the mountains instead of the valley. As soon as the Cast Iron Man stood up, the machinery began to work again, and he marched with great steps up the mountainside and over it into the kingdom of the wicked Scowleyow, where he crushed the king and all his people, and laid waste the land wherever he went. And that was their punishment for being envious of the good people of Mo. As to the fate of the Cast Iron Man, he was wound up so tightly that he kept walking straight on until he reached the sea, where he stepped into the water, went down to the bottom, and stuck fast in the mud. And I have no doubt he is there to this day. End of The Sixth Surprise. Recording by Miriam Esther Goldman.
The Surprising Adventures of the Magical Monarch of Mo and His People. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patty Cunningham. The Surprising Adventures of the Magical Monarch of Mo and His People by L. Frank Baum. The Seventh Surprise. Timtom and the Princess Pattycake. Now of all the monarch's daughters, the most beautiful by far was the Princess Pattycake. The deep blue of her eyes made even the sky envious, and the moss roses blushed when they saw the delicate bloom on her cheeks. The long strands of her silken hair were brighter than sunbeams, while her ears were like two tiny pink shells from the seashore. Indeed, there was nothing in all the valley so dainty and pretty as Princess Pattycake, and many young men would have loved her had they dared. But alas, the princess had a most terrible temper, and never was pleased with anything. So the young men, and even the old ones, were afraid to come near her. She scolded from morning till night. She stamped her pretty foot with rage when anyone spoke to her, and if ever her brothers tried to reason with her, she boxed their ears so soundly that they were glad to let her alone. Even the good queen could not love Pattycake as she did her other children, and the king often sighed when he thought of the ugly disposition of his beautiful daughter. Of course no one cared very much for her society, and she sat in her room all day long, refusing to join the others in their sports and games, and becoming more moody and bad-tempered the older she grew. One day a young man came to the court to bring pickled peaches to His Majesty the King. The youth's name was Timtom, and he lived so far away and came so seldom to court that never before had he seen the Princess Pattycake. When he looked into her sweet blue eyes he loved her at once for her beauty, and being both brave and bold, he went directly to the king and asked for Pattycake's hand in marriage. His Majesty was naturally surprised at so strange a request, so he said to the young man, "What does the princess say? Does she love you?" "I do not know," replied Timtom, "for I have never spoken with her." "Well," said the king, much amazed at the ignorance and temerity of the youth, "go and speak to my daughter about the matter, and then come and tell me what she replies." Timtom went at once to the room where Princess Pattycake was moodily sitting, and said boldly, "I should like to marry you." "What!" screamed the princess in a great rage. "Marry me? Go away this instant, you impudent boy, or I shall throw my shoes at your head." Timtom was both surprised and shocked at this outburst, but he realized that the princess had a remarkably bad temper. Still, he was not moved from his purpose, for she was so pretty he decided not to abandon the attempt to win her. "Do not be angry, for I love you," he pleaded, looking bravely into Pattycake's blue eyes. "Love me?" echoed the surprised princess. "That is not possible. Everyone else hates me." "They do not hate you," ventured Timtom. "It is your temper they hate." "But my temper and I are one," answered the princess harshly, as she stamped her foot. "Surely that is not so," returned the young man, "for certainly I love you, while your temper I do not like a bit. Don't you think you could love me?" "Perhaps I might, if you could cure my bad temper, but my temper will not allow me to love anyone. In fact, I believe that unless you go away at once, I shall be obliged to box your ears." There seemed to be no help for her, so Timtom left the room sadly, and going to the king, told him what she had said. "Then that is the end of the matter," declared the king, "for no one can cure Pattycake of her bad temper." "I am resolved to try, nevertheless," replied Timtom, "and if I succeed you must give me the princess in marriage." "I will, and my blessing into the bargain," answered the king heartily. Then Timtom left the court and went back to his father's house, where he thought on the problem for a week and a day. At the end of that time he was no nearer solving it than he was before, but his mother, who had noticed that her boy was in trouble, now came to him to ask the cause of his sad looks. Timtom told her all about the Princess Pattycake, and of his love for her, and the evil temper that would not be cured. His mother gave him her sympathy, and after some thought said to him, "You must go to the sorceress Maeda and ask her assistance. She is a good lady and a friend to all the king's family. I am quite sure she will aid you, if only you can find your way to the castle in which she lives." "Where is this castle?" asked Timtom, brightening up. "Away to the south, in the midst of a thick wood," answered his mother. "Then," said he sturdily, "if this castle exists, I will surely find it, for to win Pattycake is my only hope of happiness." The next day he set out on his journey, filled with the hope of finding Maeda's castle and securing her assistance. Before he had gone very far, a snowstorm began to rage. Now the snowstorms in Mo are different from ours, for the snow is popcorn, and on this day it fell so thick and fast that poor Timtom had much difficulty in wading through it. He was obliged to stop frequently to rest, and ate a great deal of the popcorn that cumbered his path, for it was nicely buttered and salted. Finally, to his joy, it stopped snowing, and then he was able to walk along easily until he came to the River of Needles. When he looked on this river he was nearly discouraged, and could not think of a way to get across, for instead of water the river flowed a perfect stream of sharp, glittering needles. Sitting down on the bank, he was wondering what he should do, when to his astonishment a small but sharp and disagreeable voice said to him, "Where are you going, stranger?" Timtom looked down between his feet and saw a black spider, which sat on a blade of grass and watched him curiously. "I am on my way to visit the sorceress Maeda," replied Timtom, "but I cannot get across the River of Needles." "They are very sharp, and would make 1,000 holes through you in an instant," remarked the spider thoughtfully, "but perhaps I can help you. If you are willing to grant me a favor in return, I will gladly build a bridge so you may cross the river in safety." "What is the favor?" he asked. "I have lost an eye, and you must ask the sorceress to give me a new one, for I can see but half as well as I could before." "I will gladly do this for you," said Timtom. "Very well, then I will build you a bridge," promised the spider; "but if you have not the eye when you return, I shall destroy the bridge, and you will never be able to get home again." The young man agreed to this, for he was anxious to proceed. So the spider threw a web across the river, and then another and another, until it had made a bridge of spider web strong enough for Timtom to cross over. It bent and swayed when his weight was on the slender bridge, but it did not break, and after he was safe across he thanked the spider and renewed his promise to bring back the eye. Then he hurried away on his journey, for he had lost much time at the river. But to his dismay the young man shortly came to a deep gulf, that barred his way as completely as had the River of Needles. He peered down into it, and saw it had no bottom, but opened away off at the other side of the world. Here was an obstacle which might well dishearten the boldest traveler, and Timtom was so grieved that he sat down on the brink and wept tears of disappointment. "What is troubling you?" asked a soft voice in his ear. Turning his head, the youth saw a beautiful white bird sitting beside him. "I wish to visit the castle of the sorceress Maeda on very important business," he replied, "but I cannot get over the gulf." "I could carry you over with ease," said the bird, "and shall gladly do so, if in return you promise to grant me one favor." "What is the favor?" inquired Timtom. "I have forgotten my song through having a sore throat for a long time," replied the bird. "So try as I may, I cannot sing a single note. If you will agree to bring me a new song from the sorceress, I will take you over the gulf, and bring you back when you return; but unless you bring the song, I shall not carry you over again." Timtom joyfully agreed to this bargain, and then, sitting on the bird's neck, he was borne safely across the deep gulf. After continuing his journey for an hour without further interruption, he saw before him the edge of a great wood, and knew that in the midst of this forest of trees was the Castle of Maeda. He thought then that his difficulties were all over, and tramped bravely on until he reached the wood. What now was the youth's horror on discovering on one side of his path a great lion, crouched ready to spring on anyone who ventured to enter the wood, while on the other side was a monstrous tiger, likewise prepared to attack any intruder. The fierce beasts were growling terribly, and their eyes glowed like balls of fire. Timtom gladly would have turned back had such a thing been possible, for his heart was full of fear, but he remembered that without the bird's song and the spider's eye he could never reach home again. He also thought of the pretty face of Princess Pattycake, and this gave him courage. Resolving to perish if need be rather than fail in his adventures, the youth stepped boldly forward, and when he approached the snarling guardians of the forest, he gave one bound and dashed into the wood. At the same moment the lion leapt at him from one side and the tiger from the other, and no doubt they would have devoured him had not Timtom's foot slipped just then and thrown him flat on the ground. The lion and the tiger therefore met in mid-air, and each one thinking it had hold of Timtom, tried to tear him to pieces, with the result that in a few moments they had devoured each other instead of him. The youth now strode rapidly through the wood, and was getting along famously when he came to a high wall of jasper that completely blocked his way. It was smooth as glass, and Timtom saw no way of climbing over it. While he stood wondering how he might overcome this new obstacle, a gray rabbit hopped out from the bushes and asked, "Where do you wish to go, stranger?" "To the castle of the sorceress Maeda," answered Timtom. "Well, perhaps I can assist you," said the rabbit. "I need a new tail badly, for my old one is merely a stump, and no use at all in fly time. If you will be kind enough to get me a new tail from the sorceress Maeda, a long, nice, bushy tail, I will dig under the wall, and so make a passage for you to the other side." "I shall be pleased to return the favor by bringing you the tail," declared Timtom eagerly. "Very well, then you shall see how fast I can work," returned the rabbit. Immediately it began digging away with its little paws, and in a very short time had made a hole large enough for Timtom to crawl under the wall. "If you do not bring the tail," said the rabbit in a warning voice, "I shall fill up the hole again, so that you will be unable to get back." "Oh, I shall bring the tail, never fear," answered the youth, and hurried away toward the Castle of Maeda, which was now visible through the trees. The castle was built of pure white marble, and was very big and beautiful. It stood in a lovely garden filled with blue roses and pink buttercups, where fountains of gold spouted showers of diamonds and rubies and emeralds and amethysts, all of which sparkled in the sun so gorgeously that it made Timtom's eyes ache just to look at them. However, he had not come to admire these things, gorgeous and beautiful though they were, but to win the Princess Pattycake, so he walked to the entrance of the castle, and seeing no one about, entered the great doorway and passed through. He found himself in a passageway covered with mother of pearl, where many electric lights were hidden in shells of most exquisite tintings. At the other end of the passage was a door studded with costly gems. Timtom walked up to this door and knocked on it. Immediately it swung open, and the youth found himself in a chamber entirely covered with diamonds. In the center was a large diamond throne, and on this sat Maeda, clothed in a pure white gown, with a crown of diamonds on her brow, and in her hand a golden scepter tipped with one enormous diamond, that glowed like a ball of fire. Above the throne was a diamond-covered chandelier, with hundreds of electric lights, and these made the grand chamber of diamonds glitter so brightly that Timtom was nearly blinded, and had to shade his eyes with his hand. But after a few moments he grew accustomed to the brightness, and advancing to the throne fell on his knees before the sorceress, and begged her earnestly to grant him her assistance. Maeda was the most beautiful woman in all the world, but she was likewise gracious and kind. So she smiled sweetly on the youth, bidding him, in a voice like a silver bell, to arise from his knees and sit before her. Timtom obeyed, and looked around for a chair, but could see none in the room. The lady made a motion with her scepter, and instantly at his side appeared a splendid diamond chair, in which the young man seated himself, finding it remarkably comfortable. "Tell me what you desire," said the sorceress in her sweet voice. "I love the Princess Pattycake," replied Timtom without hesitation, "but she has so evil a disposition that she has refused to marry me unless I am able to cure her of her bad temper. which not only makes her miserable, but ruins the pleasure of everyone about her. So, knowing your power and the kindness of your heart, I have been bold enough to seek your castle, that I may crave your assistance, without which I cannot hope to accomplish my purpose." Maida waved her sceptre thrice above her head, and a golden pill dropped at Timtom's feet. "Your request is granted," she said. "If you can induce the princess to swallow this pill, her evil temper will disappear, and I know she will love you dearly for having cured her. Take great care of it, for if it should be lost I cannot give you another. Do you wish me to grant any other request before you return to the court?" Then Timtom remembered the rabbit and the bird and the spider, and told Maida how he had promised to bring back a gift for each of them. So the kind sorceress gave him a nice bushy tail for the rabbit, and a very pretty song for the bird, and a new bright eye for the spider. These Timtom put in a little red box, and placed the box carefully in his pocket, but the golden pill he tied to the corner of his handkerchief, for that was more precious than the rest. Having thanked the generous lady for her kindness, and respectfully kissed the white hand she held out to him, Timtom left the Chamber of Diamonds, and was soon proceeding joyfully on his homeward way. In a short time he reached the wall of jasper, but the rabbit was not to be seen, so while he awaited its coming, he lay down to rest, and being tired by the long journey, was soon fast asleep. And while he slept, a sly fox stole out from the wood and discovered Timtom lying on the ground. "Oh ho!" said the sly fox to himself, "this young man has been to visit the sorceress, and I'll warrant he has some fine gift from her in that little red box I see sticking out from his pocket. I must try to steal that box, and see what is in it." Then, while the youth slumbered, unconscious of danger, the sly fox carefully drew the little red box from his pocket, and taking it in his mouth, ran off into the woods with it. Soon after this the rabbit came back, and when it saw Timtom lying asleep, it awakened him and asked, "Where is my new tail?" "Oh, I have brought you a fine one," replied Timtom with a smile. "It is in this little red box." But when he searched for the box, he discovered it had been stolen. So great was his distress at the loss that the gray rabbit was sorry for him. "I shall never be able to get home again," he moaned, weeping tears of despair, "for all the gifts Maida gave me are now lost forever." "Never mind," said the rabbit. "I shall allow you to go under the wall without giving me the tail, for I know you tried to keep your promise. I suppose I can make this stubby tail do a while longer, since it is the only one I ever possessed. But beware when you come to the bird and the spider, for they will not be so kind to you as I am. The bird has no heart at all, and the spider's heart is hard as a stone. Still I advise you to keep up your courage, for if you are brave and fearless you may succeed in getting home after all. If you cannot cross the gulf and the river of needles, you are welcome to come back and live with me." Hearing this, Timtom dried his eyes and thanked the kind rabbit, after which he crawled under the wall and resumed his journey. He became more cheerful as he trudged along, for the golden pill was still safe in the corner of his handkerchief. When he came to the white bird, and began to explain how it was he had lost the song and could not keep his promise, the bird became very angry, and refused to listen to his excuses. Nor could he induce it to carry him again across the gulf. "I shall keep my word," declared the bird stiffly, "for I warned you that if you returned without the song I should refuse to assist you further." Poor Timtom was at his wits' end to know what to do, so he sat down near the brink of the gulf and twirled his thumbs, and tried to keep up his courage and think of some plan, while the white bird strutted around in a cold and stately manner. Now it seems that just about this time the sly fox reached his den and opened the little red box to see what was in it. The spider's eye, being small, rolled out into the moss and was lost. The fox thought he would put the bushy tail on himself and see if it would not add to his beauty, and while he did this, the song escaped from the box and was blown by the wind directly to the spot where Timtom was sitting beside the gulf. He happened to hear the song coming, so he took off his hat and caught it, after which he called to the bird that he had found the song again. "Then I shall keep my promise," said the bird. "First, however, let me try the song and see if it is suited to my voice." So he tried the song and liked it fairly well. "It sounds something like a comic opera," said the bird, but after all it will serve my purpose very nicely." A minute later Timtom rejoiced to find himself on the other side of the gulf, and so much nearer home. But when he came to the River of Needles there was more trouble in store for him, for the spider became so angry at the loss of its eye that it tore down the spider web bridge, and refused to build another. This was indeed discouraging to the traveler, and he sat down beside the river and looked longingly at the farther shore. The spider paid no attention to him, but curled up and went to sleep, and the needles looked at him curiously out of their small eyes as they flowed by in an endless stream. After a time a wren came flying along, and when it noticed the look of despair on Timtom's face, the little creature perched on his shoulder and asked, "What is your trouble, young man?" Timtom related his adventures to the sympathetic wren, and when he came to the loss of the spider's eye and the refusal of the spiteful creature to allow him to cross the bridge, the wren exclaimed, with every appearance of surprise, "A spider's eye, did you say? Why, I believe that is what I have here in my claw." "Where?" cried Timtom eagerly. The wren hopped into his lap, and carefully opening one of its tiny claws, disclosed the identical spider's eye which Maeda had given him. "That is wonderful!" exclaimed Timtom in amazement. "But where did you get it?" "I found it in the wood, hidden in the moss near the den of the sly fox. It is so bright and sparkling I thought I would take it home for my children to play with. But now, as you seem to want it so badly, I shall have much pleasure in restoring it to you." Timtom thanked the little wren most gratefully, and called to the spider to come and get its eye. When the spider tried the eye, and found that it fitted perfectly and was even brighter than the old one, it became very polite to the young man, and soon built the bridge again. Having passed over the glittering needles in safety, Timtom pushed forward on his way, being urged to haste by the delays he had suffered. When he reached the place where he had encountered the snowstorm, he found the birds had eaten all the popcorn, so he was able to proceed without interruption. At last he reached the Monarch of Mo's palace, and demanded an audience with the Princess Pattycake. But the young lady, being in an especially bad temper that day, positively refused to see him. Having overcome so many obstacles, Timtom did not intend to be thwarted by a sulky girl, so he walked boldly to the room where the princess sat alone, everyone being afraid to go near her. "Good day, my dear Pattycake," he said pleasantly. "I have come to cure your bad temper." "I do not want to be cured," cried the princess angrily. "Go away at once, or I shall hurt you." "I shall not go away until you have promised to marry me," replied Timtom firmly. At this Pattycake began to scream with rage, and threw her shoe straight at his head. Timtom dodged the shoe and paid no attention to the naughty action, but continued to look at the pretty princess smilingly. Seeing this, Pattycake rushed forward, and seizing him by his hair, began to pull with all her strength. At the same time she opened her mouth to scream, and while it was open Timtom threw the golden pill down her throat. Immediately the princess released his hair and sank at his feet, sobbing and trembling, while she covered her pretty face with her hands to hide her blushes and shame. Timtom tenderly patted her bowed head and tried to comfort her, saying, "Do not weep, sweetheart, for the bad temper has left you at last, and now everyone will love you dearly." "Can you forgive me for having been so naughty?" asked Pattycake, looking up at him pleadingly from her sweet blue eyes. "I have forgiven you already," answered Timtom promptly, "for it was not you, but the temper that made you so naughty." The Princess Pattycake dried her tears and kissed Timtom, promising to marry him, and together they went to seek the king and queen. Those good people were greatly delighted at the change in their daughter, and consented at once to the betrothal. A week later there was a great feast in the Valley of Mo, and much rejoicing among the people, for it was the wedding day of Timtom and the Princess Pattycake. End of the 7th surprise. Recording by Patty Cunningham.
Surprise of the surprising adventures of the Magical Monarch of Mo and his people. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Caroline Shapiro. The Surprising Adventures of the Magical Monarch of Mo and His People by L. Frank Baum. The Eighth Surprise. The Bravery of Prince Jollikin. There is no country so delightful but that it suffers some disadvantages, and so it was with the Valley of Mo. At times the good people were obliged to leave their games and sports to defend themselves against a foe or some threatened disaster. But there was one danger they never suspected, which at last came upon them very suddenly. Away at the eastern end of the valley was a rough plain, composed entirely of loaf-sugar covered with boulders of rock candy, which were piled up in great masses reaching nearly to the foot of the mountains, containing many caves and recesses. The people seldom came here, as there was nothing to tempt them, the rock candy being very hard and difficult to walk on. In one of the great hollows formed by the rock candy lived a monstrous Gigaboo, completely shut in by the walls of its cavern. It had been growing and growing for so many years that it had attained an enormous size. For fear you may not know what a Gigaboo is, I shall describe this one. Its body was round like that of a turtle, and on its back was a thick shell. From the center of the body rose a long neck, much like that of a goose, with a most horrible-looking head perched on the top of it. This head was round as a ball and had 4 mouths on the sides of it, and 7 eyes set in a circle and projecting several inches from the head. The Gigaboo walked on 10 short but thick legs, and in front of its body were 2 long arms, tipped with claws like those of a lobster. So sharp and strong were these claws that the creature could pinch a tree in 2 easily. Its eyes were remarkably bright and glittering, one being red in color, another green, and the others yellow, blue, black, purple, and crimson. It was a dreadful monster to see. Only no one had yet seen it, for it had grown up in the confinement of its cave. But one day the Gigaboo became so big and strong that in turning around it broke down the walls of the cavern, and finding itself at liberty, the monster walked out into the lovely Valley of Mo to see how much evil it could do. The first thing the Gigaboo came to was a large orchard of preserved apricots, and after eating a great quantity of the preserves it wilfully cut off the trees with its sharp claws and utterly ruined them. Why the Gigaboo should have done this I cannot tell, but scientists say these creatures are by nature destructive and love to ruin everything they come across. One of the people, being in the neighborhood, came on the monster and witnessed its terrible deeds. Whereupon he ran in great terror to tell the king that the Gigaboo was on them and ready to destroy the entire valley. Although no one had ever before seen a Gigaboo, or even heard of one, the news was so serious that in a short time the king and many of his people came to the place where the monster was, all having hastily armed themselves with swords and spears. But when they saw the Gigaboo, they were afraid, and stood gazing at it in alarm, without knowing what to do or how to attack it. "Who among us can hope to conquer this great beast?" asked the king in dismay. "Yet something must be done, or soon we shall not have a tree left standing in all the Valley of Mo." The people looked at one another in a frightened way, but no one volunteered his services or offered to advise the monarch what to do. At length Prince Jollikin, who had been watching the monster earnestly, stepped forward and offered to fight the Gigaboo alone. "In a matter of this kind," said he, "one man is as good as a dozen. So you will all stand back, while I see where the beast can best be attacked." "Is your sword sharp?" asked his father the king anxiously. "It was the sharpest on the tree," replied the prince. "If I fail to kill the monster, at least it cannot kill me, although it may cause me some annoyance. At any rate, our trees must be saved, so I will do the best I can." With this manly speech he walked straight toward the Gigaboo, which, when it saw him approaching, raised and lowered its long neck and twirled its head around, so that all the 7 eyes might get a glimpse of its enemy. Now you must remember, when you read what follows, that no inhabitant of the Valley of Mo can ever be killed by anything. If one is cut to pieces, the pieces still live, and although this seems strange, you will find, if you ever go to this queer valley, that it is true. Perhaps it was the knowledge of this fact that made Prince Jollikin so courageous. "If I can but manage to cut off that horrible head with my sword," thought he, "the beast will surely die." So the prince rushed forward and made a powerful stroke at its neck. But the blow fell short and cut off instead one of the Gigaboo's 10 legs. Quick as lightning the monster put out a claw and nipped the prince's arm which held the sword, cutting it from its body. As the sword fell, the prince caught it in his other hand and struck again, but the blow fell on the beast's shell and did no harm. The Gigaboo, now very angry, at once nipped off the prince's left arm with one of its claws and his head with the other. The arm fell on the ground, and the head rolled down a little hill behind some bonbon bushes. The prince, having lost both arms and his head as well, now abandoned the fight and turned to run, knowing it would be folly to resist the monster further. But the Gigaboo gave chase, and so swiftly did its 9 legs carry it that soon it overtook the prince and nipped off both his legs. Then, its 7 eyes flashing with anger, the Gigaboo turned toward the rest of the people as if seeking a new enemy. But the brave men of Mo, seeing the sad plight of their prince and being afraid of the awful nippers on the beast's claws, decided to run away, which they did, uttering as they went loud cries of terror. But had they looked back, they might not have gone so fast nor so far. For when the Gigaboo heard their cries, it in turn became frightened, having been accustomed all its life to silence, so that it rushed back to its cavern of rock candy and hid itself among the boulders. When Prince Jollikin's head stopped rolling, he opened his eyes and looked about him, but could see no one, for the people and the Gigaboo had now gone. So, being unable to move, he decided to lie quiet for a time, and this was not a pleasant thing for an active young man like the prince to do. To be sure, he could wiggle his ears a bit and wink his eyes, but that was the extent of his powers. After a few minutes, because he had a cheerful disposition and wished to keep himself amused, he began to whistle a popular song, and then, becoming interested in the tune, he whistled it over again with variations. The prince's left leg, lying a short distance away, heard his whistle and, recognizing the variations, at once ran up to the head. "Well," said the prince, "here is a part of me at any rate. I wonder where the rest of me can be." Just then, hearing the sound of his voice, the right leg ran up to the head. "Where is my body?" asked the prince, but the legs did not know. "Pick up my head and place it on top of my legs," continued the prince. "Then, with my eyes and your feet, we can hunt around until we find the rest of me." Obeying this command, the legs took the head and started off, and perhaps you can imagine how funny the prince's head looked perched on his legs, with neither body nor arms. After a careful search, they found the body lying upon the ground at the foot of a shrimp salad tree. But nothing more could be done without the arms, so they next searched for those, and having discovered them, the legs kicked them to where the body lay. The arms now took the head from the legs and put the legs on the body where they belonged. Then the right arm stuck the left arm in its place, after which the left arm picked up the right arm and placed it also where it belonged. Then all that remained was for the prince to place his head on his shoulders, and there he was, as good as new. He picked up his sword and was feeling himself all over to see if he was put together right, when he chanced to look up and saw the Gigaboo again coming toward him. The beast had recovered from its fright, and tempted by its former success, again ventured forth. But Prince Jollikin did not intend to be cut to pieces a second time. He quickly climbed a tree and hid himself among the branches. Presently the Gigaboo came to the tree and reached its head up to eat a cranberry tart. Quick as a flash the prince swung his sword downward, and so true was his stroke that he cut off the monster's head with ease. Then the Gigaboo rolled over on its back and died, for wild and ferocious beasts may be killed in Mo as well as in other parts of the world. Having vanquished his enemy, Prince Jollikin climbed down from the tree and went to tell the people that the Gigaboo was dead. When they heard this joyful news, they gave their prince 3 cheers and loved him better than ever for his bravery. The king was so pleased that he presented his son with a tin badge set with diamonds, on the back of which was engraved the picture of a Gigaboo. Although Prince Jollikin was glad to be the hero of his nation and enjoyed the triumph of having been able to conquer his ferocious enemy, he did not escape some inconvenience. For as the result of his adventure, he found himself very stiff in the joints for several days after his fight with the Gigaboo. End of the 8th surprise. Recording by Caroline Shapiro, Oakland, California, USA.